The introduction of copper and bronze metallurgy brought significant changes to the lives of people living in Europe. However, during the early Bronze Age, stone tools were not simply replaced overnight by metal ones. Flint-knapped objects had a place in the lives of Bronze Age people for some time, being used for both utilitarian and symbolic functions. Flint daggers appear without much precedent during the late Neolithic or early Bronze Age, during a cultural tradition known as the Bell Beaker phenomenon. This archaeological culture is identified by their distinctive pottery, called Bell Beakers, individual burials beneath round mounds, and grave goods containing weapons of copper, bronze, or flint, alongside other funerary objects. Beaker peoples are responsible for the creation of several different types of daggers found across Europe. Those who lived in Britain had their own unique dagger tradition, which is the style that I'm currently replicating. British Beaker people may have copied daggers from Northern Europe in order to signal shared identity with these groups. While also objects of display, these daggers would have functioned as sidearms for the warriors of this time. The early Bronze Age saw changes in technology, along with changes in existing political structures, and the movement of people and material culture practices across Western Europe. The earliest dates for the Bell Beaker phenomenon in Europe are around 2800 BCE, in the regions of Iberia and southern France. Bell Beaker can be conceived of as a cultural package, the styles of artifacts and cultural behaviors that are archaeologically visible and distinct. The Beaker package includes, first and foremost, Bell Beakers themselves, ceramic vessels with specific decorations and no handles. Lipid analysis has revealed that these served as drinking cups for both alcoholic beverages and dairy products. Early Bell Beakers have internationally shared styles, but as time went on, regional Beaker people communities developed their own vessel styles. These pots were typically placed in single male burials, capped with round mounts, which are another component of the Beaker package. Weaponry, small stone and metal objects were placed in these burials across the sphere of Beaker society, the final component of the Beaker package. Flint daggers, like the one that I'm making, are one such object commonly associated with Beaker inhumations in Britain. The earliest appearance of Bell Beakers in the British archaeological record dates to around 2500 BCE, likely being introduced by Dutch Beaker communities. Earlier archaeological conceptions of Bell Beaker thought of them as a mass migration of people that moved and settled across Western Europe. Further work has shown that this is not the case. There is definitely evidence for the long-distance movement of people during the late Neolithic and early Bronze Age. The famous Amesbury archer, whose burial was found in Britain near Stonehenge, was one such individual. Isotope analysis shows that he began his life in continental Europe, coming to Britain later in his life. A handful of other Beaker individuals have been analyzed to show this movement throughout their lives. A robust study of Beaker remains across Britain shows that about 29% of these people were migrants into local populations. However, the same study showed that only a handful of migrants were from mainland Europe. Most were people who had been traveling around in Britain. So it turns out migration was only a single factor in the spread of the Bell Beaker phenomenon. Cultural transmission, as well as intermarriage with groups of local people, were significant factors in the spread of the Bell Beaker phenomenon. The spread of the beaker package may have also taken place by more forceful means. During this time period, archaeologists see evidence for the rise of local elites. These elites may have been adopting the beaker way of life as they threw off existing power structures, or beaker people may have even been helping facilitate the rise of these elites within their communities. Beaker groups seemed to be in a continual process of budding off, expanding, consolidating, and expanding again. This happened as people migrated, married into and influencing local groups, and as groups adopted the beaker lifestyle as they encountered it. The result is a patchwork distribution of beaker societies across Western Europe. British beaker daggers are found in contexts that radiocarbon date to a time frame of 2250 to 2000 calibrated BCE. Most daggers have been recovered in southeast England, but have been recovered from Kent to Cornwall and north to Orkney. They've been discovered in a number of contexts, including isolated finds and domestic contexts, but a number are found as part of rich, single inhumation burials. While being a distinctive artifact type from the late Neolithic and early Bronze Age of Britain, only a little over 400 examples of British beaker daggers are known. There are generally three categories of dagger found in Britain: those of Scandinavian origin, short-taned British daggers, and long-taned British daggers. The category of dagger that I'm flintknapping is one of the long-taned variety. There are 4 different classes of long-taned beaker dagger, although there is a great deal of overlap between these different classes in the archaeological record. Class 1 flint daggers are the smallest of the British forms, and have the most distinction between the tang and blade portions. The widest point of the dagger is usually the portion of the blade close to the junction with the tang. The blade and the tangs are about the same length in most examples. The bases of these Class 1 daggers are usually round or flat, with an average length of 139mm and an average maximum width of 49mm. About a third are notched, with the notches generally placed at the junction of the tang and blade, with considerable constriction of the tang width just past the notches. The regions they are most commonly recovered from include northern East Anglia and the northwest of England. 3 examples of Class 1 daggers have been found in burials. Class 2 and Class 3 beaker flint daggers are the largest classes of British beaker dagger. On average, the Class 2 length is 154mm, with an average maximum blade width of 59mm, and maximum tang width of 51mm. They are characterized by a broad leaf-shaped blade, with its widest point about 4/5 of the distance from the blade tip to the junction of the blade and tang. There's sometimes a clear junction between the blade and tang. The tang edges tend to be quite tapered, with the butt of the tang being flat or rounded in most cases, although a few that are pointed are known. The blade tends to be slightly longer than the tang. Most of the Class 2 daggers have notches, and the tang tapers in width quite visibly past that point. Most examples of this class have more than one pair of notches. Class 2 daggers are found only in England and Wales, with noticeable concentrations in East England, Lincolnshire, and the East Riding of Yorkshire. 5 Class 2 daggers have been recovered from known burial contexts. The dagger I am flintknapping is a Class 2 dagger replica. Class 3 flint daggers are the most numerous type of British beaker dagger, having the same average length as Class 2 daggers, 154mm, only being narrower on average. The average maximum width for Class 3 daggers is 54mm, and 48mm for the maximum tang width, with the blade and tang being about equal in length. The Class 3 daggers are characterized by a leaf-shaped blade, with the widest point about 4/5 of the distance from the blade tip to the junction of the blade and hafting part. What separates Class 2 and Class 3 daggers is that the latter has a narrower average width, while also lacking a shoulder or visible distinction at the junction of the blade and tang, except where notches are present in about 40% of Class 3 daggers. Even in Class 3 examples with notches, there is a smooth transition between the blade and tang areas. One of the most noticeable differences between this class and other classes of flint daggers is that 40% of Class 3 specimens have pointed butts, while the other 60% are equally divided among flat and rounded tang butts. This class is widely distributed across Britain, but is the only type found in southeast England. A large cluster of the finds occur in northern East Anglia, and less dense clusters occur in Wessex and Yorkshire. 16 known examples have been recovered from funerary contexts. Class 4 daggers are leaf-shaped and have no clear break between the blade and tang. They're typically smaller than other dagger classes, with an average length of 140mm, an average maximum blade width of 47mm, and a tang width of 44mm. The blade is usually longer than the tang, the edges of which tend to be somewhat or very tapered. The known sample of these daggers' butts are mostly equally divided between being pointed or rounded, though some squared examples are known. 21 examples of Class 4 daggers have been recovered from funerary contexts. The kinds of grave goods placed in British beaker burials differs through time. During the earliest presence of beaker in Britain, 2450 to 2300 BCE, burials were accompanied with Bell Beaker vessels known as low carnated Bell Beakers. Other grave goods to accompany these burials include copper knives, stone wrist guards, barbed and tanged flint arrowheads, flint tools, boar's tusks, bone pins, antler or bone spatulae, belt rings, iron pyrite strikelights, gold hair tresses, rings, and other ornaments. The Amesbury Archer is an example of such a burial. Beginning around 2300 or 2250 calibrated BCE and continuing to around 1950 BCE, a wide range of locally developed British pottery styles were being placed in graves. These are simply referred to as beakers, rather than bell beakers, since they are distinct from the earlier international styles. Copper, which was quickly succeeded by bronze, was used for knives and daggers that were placed in these burials. This is also the time frame in which flint daggers were placed in graves, though flint beaker daggers and bronze daggers have yet to be recovered together within the same burial. Flint beaker daggers in funerary contexts are often associated with a beaker vessel style known as long-necked beakers. Other stone artifacts in these beaker burials include battle axes and axe hammers. Prestige ornaments in jet and amber, such as V-perforated buttons, beads, pulley rings, and disc beads were also deposited as grave goods, along with bronze awls and bone pins. The vast majority of beaker burials contain adult males, lying on their left side in a tightly flexed position. 43 British beaker daggers have been found as part of burial contexts, with some burials containing daggers considered quite rich in terms of funerary offerings. little can be said about raw material choice for beaker daggers, other than large, high-quality pieces of flint with few inclusions were sought after. English flint occurs in chalk deposits in a range of workability, much of which is excellent flint-knapping material. I did not have access to English flint or similar European chalk flints for the making of this dagger. As such, I chose to use Georgetown flint for flint-knapping my beaker dagger. Georgetown flint is the only North American lithic material that occurs in chalk. This is differentiated from chert, which occurs in limestone. Thus, Georgetown flint was my best alternative material available in place of flint from the British Isles. Unlike bifacial axes, which have well-documented production sites, there are not any known, traceable production sites for British beaker daggers. The flint knappers who made beaker daggers left cortex, the outer chalky layer on flint, remaining on the piece about 30% of the time, occurring almost always in the tang and basal portions. These cortex portions were ground down in most cases. Grinding was also done in some instances on the blade portion when hinge fractures and stacked hinges could not be removed by flaking in an attempt to thin these portions down to the rest of the face. While some beaker daggers are known to have parallel pressure flaking, most do not and exhibit random percussion flaking over most of their faces. This contrasts with the well-known Danish daggers made by beaker peoples during roughly the same time, many of which exhibit fine patterned pressure flaking. Notches are one of the things that distinguish British daggers from the other types of beaker daggers manufactured in mainland Europe. Notches are not present on the majority of daggers, nor are their placement or the number of notches consistent. Notches can range from well-defined large or deep ones to a little more than unifacially flaked indents. Most notches are paired with a notch on the opposite edge of the tang, but some examples are known with unpaired notches. The most extreme examples have 8 or 9 notch pairs, but 1 or 2 pairs are the most common number. Notches, while inconsistent in frequency and placement, would have aided in hafting these daggers. Handles may have been as simple as a plant fiber or leather cord wrapping, or they could have been more complex, involving pieces of wood, antler, or bone fastened together with cordage and glue. Handle construction may have differed over time, with the different dagger classes, or perhaps for each individual dagger. Residue, streaks, and stains are known on a number of dagger tangs, and almost certainly represent the traces of hafting. One famous dagger has crisscrossing brown streaks on the face between the edge notches at the junction of the blade and tang. Closely grouped stains and streaks are known on a number of other daggers. Some daggers have been examined to show that these stains are traces of resin and fine organic fibers. The resemblance British beaker daggers have to early forms of Danish daggers in Northern Europe has not gone unnoticed by archaeologists. Some scholars argue that the similarity is an intentional effort to call back the British adoption of the beaker package from their possible Dutch origin. By wearing or displaying one's dagger, you would be affiliating yourself with a continental, ancestral beaker identity and signaling your participation in connection to larger scale contact networks across the beaker world. Beaker daggers are not just used as objects for identity, signaling, and prestige. Microware analysis shows their users regularly pulled them in and out of leather sheaths, and demonstrates that these daggers are not just left in place all the time and left unused. Most daggers from Britain have resharpening done to the edge. However, it's important to note that there have not been any daggers found to date that are exhausted to the point where the dagger can no longer function. This is good evidence that daggers were not used as commonplace tools. While definitely used, as demonstrated by the resharpening, their use must have been restricted. While being large and thin flint objects, daggers were not delicate items and were perfectly functional as weapons. Forthcoming experimental research by Flintknapper and archaeologist John Kiernan demonstrates Beaker daggers would have been lethal when employed as a sidearm. While more than capable of being used in a fight, daggers were not intended as a primary weapon. Bows were the primary weapon of interpersonal conflict during the early Bronze Age. The inclusion of archery equipment like barbed and tanked arrowheads and wrist guards in adult male burials seems to highlight the importance of this weapon for warriors. Spears would have also had a place as a weapon in melee combat situations. However, were the need to arise, the Beaker dagger would have functioned as a lethal weapon against would-be attackers. Archaeologists may never find direct evidence of these daggers being used as weapons, but what we do know is that these daggers' inclusion in adult male burials signals their importance to men of this time, both as a symbol of identity and as a weapon should its bearer need to defend themselves. By the late Neolithic and early Bronze Age, agriculture and domesticated animals had come to play a central role in the diets of British people. Direct evidence, such as charred preserved plant remains, are rare in Beaker assemblages. Nevertheless, we know that Beaker people in Britain were growing barley and oats, and that agriculture saw a boom in Bronze Age Britain. Cattle and sheep were the primary domesticated animals that Bell Beaker people kept. They also kept pigs, but not nearly in the numbers that earlier Neolithic people did. Lipid residue analysis of Beaker ceramics shows that dairy products were becoming increasingly important for consumption, which is unsurprising with the cattle and sheep having a dominant role in Beaker people's lives. The remains of wild animals are pretty rare in Beaker faunal assemblages, so hunting brought in relatively few of the calories that these people consumed. The same study that looked at the movement of Beaker people in Britain was also able to determine that diet varied little across Beaker society in Britain, although people in the south ate more hard foods like seeds and nuts than those people in the north. This same study also revealed that marine sources of food were not a large part of their diet, even for individuals living near the coast. In general, Beaker peoples in Britain had an omnivorous diet with a fairly high amount of animal protein in it. very few beaker domestic sites with intact archaeological features have been found in Britain. This may be due to the possible ephemeral nature of their construction. It is interesting to note that there is a lack of beaker household sites that have been discovered because previous Neolithic cultures left many well-preserved household sites. However, there are exceptions where the remains of beaker structures have been preserved in the archaeological record. Beaker buildings that had stones incorporated to their design have preserved rather well. In the far north, in the Shetland Islands, there are stone houses that appear to have been used by beaker peoples. These roughly oval-shaped buildings have thick stone walls and elongated entry passages. Their internal dimensions range from 30 meters square down to houses with half that living space. Sadly, no evidence of roof structures here remain, which would indicate unpreserved organic materials were used for this part of their construction. Other Shetland region structures have been found, defined by gullies, stake holes, and post holes, which seem to be ovicular in shape. While the famous stone houses of Skara Brae and the Orkney Islands were made by earlier Neolithic people, beaker people here appear to have adapted or regenerated the stone house tradition here after the collapse of earlier societies. In the Outer Isles, 8 beaker houses have been found, with one particularly well-preserved example excavated by beaker people into a sand dune, which over time covered and helped preserve it. Stones were used as part of the wall construction to hold back the sand. It has been suggested that the roof of the stone structure here, and at other houses in places like Shetland, were roofed with an overturned boat. Irish beaker houses seem to be constructed with a mixture of post-construction, stake construction, bedding trenches, stone revetments, and sunken features. Both oval and rectangular shaped beaker dwellings have been found by archaeologists. Structures in Neolithic Ireland tend to be rectangular, while later Bronze Age houses were more oval in shape. The internal space in these structures ranges from 24 to 18 meters square, with internal hearths being found in some of these Irish beaker dwellings. In England, the evidence is also somewhat ambiguous for dwellings, but there are some structures firmly associated with the beaker people. Oval and circular remains of structures have been excavated, with some containing internal pits and hearths. These ground plans are formed by stake architecture in both single and double rows, with some using stone banks as part of the construction process. A dwelling excavated in Cambridgeshire has a ring of internal roof-supporting posts and 2 large entrance pits, the latter of which are located in the northeast of the structure. Elsewhere in Europe, Bell Beaker households differ in form but have similar issues with preservation and presence in the archaeological record. Part of this may again have to do with the flimsiness of the construction materials and techniques employed by the beaker people. Post holes and negative building imprints show that beaker dwellings in France and Switzerland were usually rectangular in shape. All structures excavated in this region were located next to a source of water, mostly rivers, but in some instances lakes as well. They were built using posts and sill beams. The width of these beaker structures is fairly consistent between sites, being 3.5 to 4.5 meters wide, although the length of these structures varies much more, in a 6 to 17 meter range. Flint daggers are an interesting example of highly skilled flintknapping in Europe's late Neolithic and early Bronze Age. The Beaker people who inhabited Britain innovated their own forms of flint daggers, even though daggers may have been part of a conscious effort to demonstrate connection to Dutch Beaker groups, who are famous for their own dagger tradition. The Beaker phenomenon spread across Europe to places like Britain through cultural transmission, intermarriage, migration, and perhaps even through the promoting of Beaker-supporting elites in local communities. Beaker people lived in a world where metallurgy was slowly taking the place of flintknapping. Local development in technology and the introduction of new ideas change other aspects of their culture until people in this region are not recognizable as Beaker in the archaeological record. The British Beaker daggers are a beautiful flourish of flintknapping skill, which was soon replaced by the increasing presence of metallurgy during the Bronze Age.